Hey folks, one of the joys of breaking in a whole new camera setup is I'm going to make a bunch of recordings that I at least am not terribly happy with. And the great thing about that is I can do some talking about what I feel like doing instead of worrying too much about staying exactly on topic or exactly on message. I can just talk to you about the stuff where I'd like the world to be a little different. Good. Those of you who've been a senior engineer know about the senior engineer mid-career slump. What I mean by that is you've made it senior engineer. The path up to that point makes sense. You get better at coding, you get better at a few related skills, you get to a professional level on things like, use source control. You make it to senior engineer. What comes next? I have had a career with a lot of hops between different jobs, between different ideas, tried different things out. I've been in engineering, I've been in operations, I've been in a lot of related fields, done some time in data science. My inability to pick one job can be your gain. I'm going to talk about several of these different paths, and some of them that you should avoid because they're not real paths, and some of them that are worth another look that might be what you want. But mainly I'm going to tell you what that next step after senior engineer looks like, because the answer is it goes off in all directions. I spent, call it 10 years full-time in C and C++ and doing systems programming, and there's a bit of other stuff, but mainly I was one of these low-level, down-in-the-bits systems programmers. It was all right. I had advanced through multiple levels of senior engineer up to architect, which is a big deal in that world because the teams it takes to build, say, an operating system are huge. One person can't do very much in that world. And so at Access Systems Americas, they're the company that bought PalmSource, among other things, we were architecting a new Palm operating system. There's a reason you've never heard of it. And I was one of initially 4 people that were sort of co-architects on the project, and folks dropped away as we went along. Architect. Architect is one of the directions you can go after senior engineer. On the one hand, the lovely thing about being an architect is you can start to make technical decisions that feel important. It's wonderful. It's as good as it looks. I highly recommend continuing to code because there's a reason the other developers resent architects who don't get in there and code. I was one of the architects that got in there and coded. The architects were, on this system, the people who got in and built code on this new system first before everybody else came into it. It was wonderful. It was wonderful. So, architect is one of those directions you can go. It has all the problems you think it does. They're less necessary on a small team. There's a lot of competition for it. And this is going to be a theme for all of these directions. If you think it's entirely a technical role, you're wrong. An architect has to not only make their decisions, they have to express why the decision is important. They have to convince people of their decisions. They have to spend an awful lot of their time telling other people why you're doing it this way, not only so that they don't disagree and do it their own way, but also so that they can take proper advantage of the path you're setting for them, of the things you want them to do. Architect. That's one of the directions you can go from there. Those of you who have heard of me know that I've spent a lot of time in Ruby. What I just described in C and C++ and Palm OS probably doesn't sound a lot like what you know me for. That was my last job in that world before I switched my career over entirely to Ruby. It took a while before I had another seriously post-senior engineer role. Making a massive switch tends to set you back a few steps, and it did with me. A couple of jobs down the line at Uyala, I had a role I'll call Oracle and Tool Builder. I don't mean Oracle like the database. I mean when people had a problem with any of a number of technologies, including Ruby language stuff, including Git stuff, including some of the NoSQL data stores we used, including a lot of the libraries we used in Ruby, I was the person they'd come to. I was the person who knew the weird fiddly bit of a lot of different technologies. And let me tell you that is not really a set of responsibilities that will take you past the senior engineer level. It's nice. It's job security. The thing is, if you're a good senior engineer, you have nearly unlimited job security. Everybody wants to hire you. And if you're willing to pick up a few more specialties, again, I've spent time in operations, I've spent time in data science, with those additional specialties, you're going to be as hireable as you want to be. You're going to have an okay full-time job about as fast as you want it for about as long as you want it. There are some things with, as you get older, it'll get harder to get a job, and it will. That's true. But you can be so hireable that with that problem, you're still going to be way ahead of almost everybody else. Overall, as a senior engineer, you're not going to be hard to hire. And so being the X guy, where X is the name of a technology, being the person that people come to for help on that technology, really only continues to have you be a senior engineer forever, with good employment. But you're a senior engineer forever. There's nothing beyond that. Tool Builder can be a perfectly good senior engineering sort of path, and what you'll find is that Tool Builder by itself is not enough to get you past that hurdle. It's not really a job after senior engineer either. It's just a senior engineer job until you combine Tool Builder with one of these other responsibilities I'll talk about. But you keep adding specialties, you can be eternally employable. That's not bad. That's nice. All right. While I was at Ooyala, I did the thing that most people know me for at this point, which is I wrote the book Rebuilding Rails. They tell you not to write a book for the money, and that's basically true. Rebuilding Rails has not, hour for hour, been nearly as lucrative a use of my time as if I was to become a freelancer on the side and do part-time work, anything like that. Although it has done an enormous amount for my day job, for my career. I'm going full-time on it now, and it's not paying the bills yet. We'll see if it does. But it gave me a big boost in terms of my job well before that, years before that. So one thing you can do is you can become known outside your company. For me, that was writing a book. I also did a bunch of conference speaking, which can also help. But you can have a thing that gives you a reputation outside of your company, maybe outside of your whole community. That will give you a boost, and it may even boost you above senior engineer, but the main way it'll do that is because this other way that you gain reputation, like me writing the book, is communication skills. And the way that you're actually going to get that boost inside the company is communication skills and business skills. Those are... So up to the point where you become a senior engineer, you mainly need to demonstrate technical skills to get ahead. Junior engineer to just engineer, engineer to senior engineer. Mostly that's based on your technical skills, and mostly at that point the engineering leadership is going to decide how good your engineering skills are and give you those promotions. Once you get beyond senior engineer, the people who decide your promotions are going to be doing it based on business needs and business value, which means you're going to be assessed on your business skills, because you have to communicate those business needs and that business value to people thinking in business, deciding whether to promote you. You're suddenly presenting the business people with a business decision, and you do that with business skills. And business skills are mostly communication skills. Not just making decisions, but telling people how to make decisions. Not just assessing information, but showing other people how you think they should assess information. All those are communication skills. And so writing a book and becoming, like a tech lead or something, these are all things that are about communications. After Ooyala, I still had my book, of course, I worked at a company called OnLive. I led a team. My title was head Rubyist early on there. I led a team that was building a Ruby framework, and I was chosen partly because I had a lot of technical skills in the relevant areas for what they were doing. But the way I actually got the kind of job I got, which was definitely a principal engineer job and not just a senior engineer job, was to sit down and have a talk with the person who was managing this team that I wound up leading, and saying, oh, you want to use Ruby in this way, you want to use Cassandra in this way for your synchronization, you want to put all of this together. Do you have an existing topic expert on using Cassandra for geographically distributed syncing? No? Here are the problems you're going to have. Here's what you should research. With luck, you can get around them. That's going to cost your team weeks, or months if you do it wrong, but here's how you can make it weeks instead of months. And by making it that kind of a business value decision, hiring me to take it from not just months down to weeks, but weeks down to days that a whole other team of people could waste, suddenly becomes an easy business decision. And so when I asked for a frankly unreasonable amount of money, they gave me not what I asked for, which was kind of ridiculous, but very nearly what I asked for, which was still quite high. The people deciding it, the people who could decide whether that amount of money was reasonable for an engineer, are by definition business people. They're managers, directors, CEOs, especially in a small company. And so you give them a business decision that they can take home. And that's practice. And it's not just practice of thinking about business, thinking about, do you produce revenue, do you reduce expenses? It's learning to communicate the way they communicate, because that is also a business skill, and it's one they do constantly. You're going to need to learn to talk like a salesperson. Oops. That wasn't why I got into being an engineer either. It's an incredibly important skill if you want to get to the higher levels of engineering, because that's how they decide who they promote. That's how they decide who gets that rank. That's how they decide who makes the decisions, because they want the decisions made by somebody who thinks the way they do, just like you want the decisions made by someone who thinks like you do, right? And to the extent that somebody seems like they think like you, you're more interested in having them in charge. They feel the same way about you in deciding on whether to give you a promotion. So, on life, head Rubyist. Eventually, the technical side of that project wound up failing for understandable reasons, and I became their entire analytics department. I think my title was analytics head, but for a while I was the whole team. I was rebuilding a massive, sprawling, unmaintained, ugly architecture that had been sitting without being touched for a long time, and I wound up rebuilding a fair bit of it. Eventually I hired an elite team. His name was Josh. So I was the head of the team, but it was a small team. But the important part about that was I reported directly to the director of engineering and did a lot of talking to the other C-level folks and to the CEO of the company, and I produced a lot of the data that became the graphs that they gave investors when trying to raise funding. Understand that the kind of person who decides whether to give you funding, a venture capitalist or someone very like that, does not speak like a software engineer, does not want to speak like a software engineer, and is used to doing a lot of tuning out software engineers. You have to give them business information and business decisions, because that's how they think. That's what they think is important. I was not directly talking to them most of the time. I was creating these graphs and letting our director of engineering, who was amazing, do the talking to them. But the more like that your communication is, the more directly and simply they can use it. And that, again, it determines how impressed they are with you and how much money they think you're worth and what sort of roles you can get. And so when you think about being a head of a team, again, I was the entire analytics team for quite a while, and I was given a long leash. I could do more or less what I wanted with it, and I rebuilt a number of parts of it. And a lot of the reason I got to keep doing that was because when they'd ask what I was doing, I would say, okay, well, here's a new interface in front of it that actually does work consistently. We have that old, nasty, unmaintained one that we've been having trouble with for a long time. Here's one that you can just point a browser at, you don't need a local client, and it currently works. Oh yeah, we've had these slow queries here, here, and here. This hasn't been updating. I've fixed that. Now it's updating. I was talking to them in terms of the numbers they used, and the way I did that was to go out and find out what numbers they used, and then give them a better interface so they would see it and say, Noah, what does Noah do? Oh, right, he fixed that thing I used to find our user numbers and find the numbers that we report to the venture capitalists. Oh, that's cool. Yeah, that's good. He gave me a prettier way to see that, which I did. That was all right. And that let me also do sort of by-the-side but important tasks like a whole new interface for the customer service team so that they could do better for all of our customers, the people who were buying service from OnLive. It was a cloud gaming service, so, subscribers to our cloud gaming service. And similarly, later, when I was producing numbers that they gave to investors, the executives in the company, you didn't have to say, Noah Gibbs, he was an engineer. No, you said Noah, and they say, oh, Noah, yeah, I know what he did. That's how you get the higher level promotions, is that people with a lot of authority in the company don't have to hear more about you. They hear your first name and they say, oh, yeah, him, I know what he did. And achieving that is a communications task. Achieving that is about finding out what they want, giving them what they want, letting them know what you've done. Becoming a senior engineer is all about the technical side. becoming a staff engineer or principal engineer or a tech lead is all about the communications side. A lot of us don't want to be managers. I do not want to be a manager. I've been a manager. I don't want to be a manager. But you can't avoid the communication skills and you can't avoid the business skills if you want to keep doing well in your career. Because it turns out that whether you are a manager or not, the people grading you, the people deciding how you're doing, are all going to be managers. There's not a way around it. They're going to be. Because above a certain level, directors, CEOs, people like that are primarily managers. Have you ever given a job interview to, let's say, an operations person, and they've already had a whole set of operations interviews, and they say, well, it does a little bit of SRE work, it's not a lot, he's not a software engineer, but could you just give him a software interview, make it quick, give him a really small question, and then you can spend the entire rest of the time talking about how excellent the company is, and he gets to talk to one of our software people, and it's win-win, it's great. And if you talk to somebody like that, and you give the quick question, and it doesn't really matter if they succeed or fail, because the people who are checking the skills that you care about, their operations skills for an operations person, have already signed off, have already said, this guy's great, we want to hire him. And you talk to him, and it turns out that he fails your very basic software interview, which is not a huge surprise. And a lot of operations people are primarily operations people. They're not software engineers. They're not trying to be software engineers. And so it was, for formality's sake, you gave the interview, he failed the interview. You'd respect him a lot more if he succeeded in that interview in your area of expertise, wouldn't you? It doesn't matter that that's not what he does. You respect that guy a little more if he's competent in your area of expertise. The same is true of business people. Their areas of expertise are things like negotiation and communicating what they did and letting other people know why they did what they did so that other folks can make the same decisions in a compatible way. And if you mess that up, they're going to think less of you, even though that's supposedly not your area of expertise. But it's worse than that, because when you get to the really high engineering ranks, that is part of your area of expertise, and if you screw it up, you're failing at what you're supposed to be good at. So, at OnLive, I went from head Rubyist to head of analytics. OnLive eventually went out of business. They were happy with me, it was very nice, but some things don't last. And I went to a company you've probably never heard of called Dacre. They make an augmented reality helmet, which is sort of like if Google Glass were built into a workman's helmet so that it had a longer battery life and more computing power. It's an interesting idea. And I was their Backend Architect / Principal Engineer. It's a mouthful of title. But basically they were a small company, and they wanted to give me the same kind of role that I'd had at a smaller company, which you wind up doing several things because a small company, there's less to do in each area. So not only did I handle a lot of the back-end server stuff and back-end storage, especially server-side storage, but also I was principal engineer with various advisory roles. I say advisory roles. A principal engineer usually takes some cross-cutting concern across the entire company, and they handle talking to every team about that cross-cutting concern. A lot of what I did as a back-end architect was to handle storage of various data that we had and make sure that the ways different teams interacted with that storage was reasonable. The client on the helmet needed to be able to be in reasonably constant contact with the servers, and if it wasn't, data wouldn't get sent back, which means we needed to be able to talk about how data would get stored versus thrown away on the client side, and for a variety of things that lived on the server side or that lived in neither one of those and talk to our infrastructure. And so a lot of what I did was to come up with the constellation of storage that would handle quick caching versus longer-term storage and user data versus user account data versus some of the large 3D scene data that we had to serve up. A principal engineer, as all of that suggests, has some concern that is bigger than one team and spends their time communicating across the multiple different teams to make sure that concern is handled well. Communicating across all the different teams to make sure that concern is handled well. And by handled well, you should not assume that this is a crystalline clear technical job. This is a thing where, especially in a small company, a lot of what you do has to be about business concerns. It has to balance, here's the amount of effort that we have, here's how bad a particular mistake is if it happens. You're not trying to eliminate all risk because that's too expensive. You're trying to figure out which risks are the largest and start tackling them in rough order of how dangerous they are times how likely they are. A principal engineer, again, has a set of concerns that are very much about business concerns, profit, risk mitigation, and communication, which again should sound like another of these communications roles. It's a role. It's not necessarily a management role. You're not necessarily directly managing people, but you're convincing people. You're persuading people. You're coming up with a way to make the way that you want to do it obvious as a good idea. You're taking other people's ideas and you're incorporating them, not only because other people know what they're talking about and often have really good suggestions, but also because a particular person is more likely to implement an idea if they came up with it. And so that means that you have this same kind of resilience, you have this same understanding that it's not about the very best, in your opinion, technical solution. It's a people role. All of these roles past senior engineer are people roles. Principal engineer, staff engineer, which is roughly the same thing, tech lead, where you often are effectively managing people, a particular topic lead, where there's a particular team and you handle that topic. All of these are that kind of thing. Architect, very much the same kind of role. My next role after DAQRI, after I stopped being the backend architect / principal engineer, was for Appfolio. It's another role a lot of you have heard of. I did a lot of writing about Ruby performance for the Appfolio engineering blog, lots and lots of conference talks. At Appfolio, the fellow role, the fellow title, was all about communication. The way most of you heard of me, those of you who heard of me, was through that blog or through the conference talks, the speaking, the writing. The way that I became known to the other performance people, and they decided that maybe I had something useful to say, was the speaking, was the writing. And the code, yeah. The code was important. But if you look at the code that I wrote, I wrote Rails Ruby Bench, which was one of the Ruby 3x3 benchmarks, and I wrote a number of other benchmarking tools of similar sorts. The amount of code is very small. The analysis of the code, sometimes mathematical analysis, but even the mathematical analysis, it's all about looking at it, figuring out what's important, and getting other people to also see that's important, getting other people to agree that that's important. There's math behind it, no question, but it's not all math. A lot of it is communication. A lot of it is, here's what I think, here's why I think it, here are various issues that I don't think are as important, here's why I don't think so, and then saying that in a way that will get other people to agree with you, which is partly just about being reasonable sounding, civil, nice. It's another communications role. It's a heavy communications role. There are a few people who get to be a fellow or a distinguished engineer or something like that and get to sit by themselves in the corner, and they're almost all people who got that role by producing something enormously popular, which again requires communicating with people. It only becomes enormously popular if you do something that causes people to like it. All right, so that's a bunch of things that I did. Apparently I like communications roles. I didn't intend to like communications roles. It just kind of happened. Now, what I do since roughly the beginning of 2020 is I've gone independent, out on my own. I'm selling Rebuilding Rails. I'm selling another book called Mastering Software Technique. Basically, I'm selling a few info products. I teach workshops. I intend to keep doing both of those things. I may wind up as an independent consultant. We'll see what happens. We'll see whether I make a successful business out of these other things that I do. And it's all communication. It's all communication. The thing about selling a product is, yes, you have to build the product, but so little of the work of writing a book and selling it is writing it, and so much of the work is selling it. Any successful author will tell you that there's an enormous amount of marketing in it. A very successful author may not be doing a lot of marketing because they may be having a publisher do that for them. But especially in this day and age, publishers don't do an enormous amount of that. publishers usually rely on you to generate buzz and convince people it's good. And yes, your readers will recommend you one person to another, and that certainly happened. I have wonderful readers. I cannot complain about what wonderful readers I have had, but the way they find me, by and large, is I write things and somebody else shares them, which means I have to write and do the initial sharing. I have to do an enormous amount of communicating. And that's doubly true of things like workshops or consulting, where I need to go to a company and say, hey, you have this need, I have this ability, let's talk about whether there's a sensible price for me doing this work for you. And companies are receptive to that. I mean, the idea that a company would hire someone to do a thing is not surprising or strange, but you have to still go ask them. You have to still go suggest it. And companies assume you do a lot of looking at what they do and why that might be important, and at least having a very good idea why they would want what you are suggesting. It's communication. All of this is communication. And so the short version of what do you do to get past the mid-career slump as a senior developer is pick some communication skills. Pick whichever ones work well for you and start leaning hard on those. It probably took me from 2012 to 2016 to solve this the way I solved it. Longer than that, really. It was before 2012. And so it's going to take you some time, and it's going to take you some work. And that's all right. Going from senior engineer to anything beyond it, it's a big step. It should be a big step, and it probably should take work. But if you're ever going to do it, it's important to understand what kind of work you should be doing. It's a big project, and you'll never get done with it unless you understand what the work on that project looks like. Now, I'm not talking about a lot of possibilities. You could found a company. Some people do that. Bad news for you on the is it communication, does it require business skills front there, though. That's a job that is heavy on communication and on business skills. So I can't tell you about every possible position, but that's going to keep being a theme. That keeps being a theme. Is above a certain point, you want to tackle challenges that are big enough, they need more people, and that means communication. Or you want to tackle challenges that are expensive enough, and that requires managing money and managing people to do things. Management. It requires management and communication. And so if you yourself are not going to be the manager, you have to still communicate to everyone what it is you're trying to do. As your scope gets bigger, at some point it gets too big for you to do everything yourself. And that means communication. Or equivalently, as you want to provide more and more value to a company and get them to pay you more and let you do more, you have to take on bigger challenges with exactly the same result. So, I hope it's good news for a few of you, what I have to say. I hope it's useful for many of you. And thank you for listening. It's always wonderful to talk to folks.